In this video, I'll show you how to illustrate a 3D model using depth of field and surface textures. Open the library composed PSD file, select Layer 1, and go to the 3D panel. Select the current view node in the 3D panel, and right up here on the Properties panel, you'll see that there are two controls for depth of field. Right now, depth is set to 0, so we don't see any depth of field. That is, everything is in clear focus. Watch what happens if I increase this value by dragging the slider to the right. Everything starts to blur out. But notice that the blur is greater here in the foreground, and it's less blurry over here. Where the blur occurs is controlled here with the distance slider. So if I drag this to the left, you'll see that the area which is in sharp focus is now moving, and it's sort of in the middle of the complex. And as I move this over more, you'll see that now this area is in sharp focus, and it fades out and gets blurrier as you go further away. I think this is too much blur, so I'm going to tone down the depth and bring that closer to 1. So that's an interesting improvement to this model, where we have more of a camera effect now that we're using to draw our eye's attention to a specific part of the model. Now I'd like to go to the Scene node here, and up here on the surface area, we're displaying this with a solid style. That's allowing us to see the texture maps. There's also an option down here called Sketch, and it's grayed out because I am using depth of field, and these two features are incompatible with each other. But I'd like to use them both. So to do that, I simply need to duplicate the 3D layer. So I'll go to the Layers panel, and I'll drag this layer thumbnail from Layer 1 down here and drop it on the new icon. That will duplicate this layer. Now I have a copy. So in the copy, I'm going to go back to the 3D panel, select the current view node, and change depth to 0. Then go to the Scene node and open up the Style dropdown and choose Sketch. You see now it's enabled. So we're getting a sketchy effect, but it's too dark. To brighten this up and see it better, we need to go to the Environment node and increase the intensity right here in the Properties panel. So drag this slider to the right, and it will become brighter. Notice, however, that it is in grayscale, so I want to see the color, and that color is still available in the original 3D layer. So go back to the Layers panel and toggle off Layer 1 Copy. So now we're seeing the original texture maps from Layer 1. So the copy is containing the sketch effect, and Layer 1 contains the depth of field effect. I'd like to blend these together to make a more interesting illustration. And you can do that very easily by changing the blend mode to soft light. You can experiment with different blend modes. You can try hard light, you can try overlay. You can also tone it down by decreasing the opacity of this layer. I'll go with soft light with a somewhat reduced opacity here. And that gives me a bit of a sketchy effect, which is more interesting in this particular 3D model. However, I find that the area of the building over here that's in shadow, and again over here, is too dark. So to brighten that, I'll select Layer 1, go to the 3D panel, select the Environment node, and then up here in the Properties panel, increase the intensity, and that brightens that up. You can dial that in exactly how you like it. So in this way, you can balance the amount of blur that is controlled by the depth of field parameters, and you can introduce a certain amount of texture. Let's go back to Layer 1 Copy and then go to the 3D panel and select the environment node. We can control how dark that is here. We can also go to the scene node, and we can change the texture from the default texture to one that we load from a particular file, or we could generate it from the brush. Let's try this option. This takes a moment to calculate, and it's going to use the current brush to create brush strokes all over the model. So this is an alternative to the default texture. It's a bit too rough compared to the original. I think I preferred the default sketch. I'll go back to that. And so in this way, you've learned to create a more interesting illustration using depth of field and surface textures.